Hi, I'm Todd Austin. I'm a professor at University of Michigan, and this is a presentation I give to many new researchers, student researchers here at University of Michigan, and it focuses on how to get into doing research. The title is called "The Zen of Research," and let's take a look. When it can be one of the most, I would say, nerve-wracking times of your entire career when you first embark into the research world. You have there's many questions that you get pummeled with at the same time, like what should I do the research on? Is the research I'm doing worthwhile, et cetera, et cetera. And often students are challenged by even the question of, like, what is research? Is this thing that I'm doing research? And so let me give you my definition of what is research. This is just my definition. Everybody can, many faculty have their own definition. This is one that works really well for me. Um, for me, research is when my students that I'm working with, my researcher students I'm working with, are teaching me something new, important to me and to them, and insightful. And by insightful, I mean it's not just numbers that we're looking at, it's actually understanding the system and why it is acting the way it is acting. And when that happens, we're actually doing research. And then just a quick little note about doing research. Research often involves many collaborators, myself and my students and their other faculty collaborators, et cetera. And often the research goals between the many different persons working together can be very different. So, um, as an example, what's the goal of a PhD student? What is it that they're trying to accomplish? And um, I think that often people answer, do original research, uh, make an impact in the world of your research area, etc. But I think really the answer to that question should be is to get a PhD, right? And that's a pretty complex process, right? You have to demonstrate that you have the ability to do research, that you have all the skills necessary to be a researcher, to present your work, to write up your work, to find interesting problems, to pursue those interesting problems in a way where the results are credible, etc. Um, your professors, advisors, employers may have different things. Like, as a professor, I may want to be getting my quarterly report done to my sponsor because I need to have results here in the next few weeks, for example. So often my goals are different than my students' goals. And so we all need to accommodate each other's goals. There's this saying, right? Fake it till you make it. And if you want to be a researcher, fake it till you make it. And the way you fake it is you do what researchers do. And these are examples of things that researchers do. And as you do these things, you'll notice that one day, hey, I'm a researcher. I'm actually doing research. Because why? I did these things, and I try to pursue interesting problems and to understand those problems. So what do researchers do? Well, researchers read a lot of research papers. They have to be up to date on the area that they are working in. As a PhD student, it's often the case that you will become even a greater expert than your mentor and advisors are, because you are just steeped in this particular problem and area. And you can very quickly become fully read in it, and you'll know all the new stuff that's happening. This is important because it trains you to do new and interesting research in that area. It enlightens you to what already has been done in that area, so you don't accidentally do a piece of research over again. So it's incredibly important to do a lot of reading of papers. There's more efficient and less efficient ways to read papers. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Other things you should do is you should discuss your ideas with your fellow students. Here at University of Michigan, for example, there's awesome students everywhere and really top faculty in all kinds of different areas. And, so it really behooves the student researcher to bounce their ideas off these other really talented people in our environment. Now, in order to do that, though, you really have to be in the department. So, we couldn't do this during COVID, but, now that, everything's back open again, we really want to be in the department and spending time as much as possible with our fellow students and colleagues. What you should do as a researcher, you should start trying to move towards a thesis topic. And that could be just a kind of a research vector that you're going on. That's pretty important to do that. Because when you do your PhD, you're going to have original research in that. So you want to be doing the reading and the discussing and all the other things you do as a researcher in a vector at some point. You don't have to do that from day one, but the sooner you can get into that vector of research, the more quickly you can complete your PhD. I would say as you interact with other persons in your research journey, be especially tolerant of reacting with faculty, because faculty tend to be very, very busy and pulled in many different directions. And, it's not unlike, it's not unlikely that, you may have a regular meeting with your advisor, PhD advisor, but that meeting will have to be moved on a regular basis because, he or she has lots of other obligations that creep into that. So just be really patient with your faculty, mentors when it comes to scheduling and meeting and such. I think the more patient you are, the better experience you'll have with those people, because those people are really demanded upon. They are world experts. And so it's having that patience and understanding, I think, is a really important aspect of developing a good relationship with a top research advisor. And then show constructive initiative, push forward, try to do work, try not to get paralyzed. That can be very difficult to not get paralyzed, but try to push forward by doing these things on this list. And any of these things can be accomplished without even knowing what it is your research area or the specific topic you're going to work on is. And then take every opportunity to express the ideas that you are developing in written and oral presentation form, because these are two skills, writing papers and presenting that work, that you're going to have to get those skills, and you're going to have to demonstrate those skills as part of getting a PhD. And then once you get into your career, having those powerful skills is, really valuable to your overall success. Here's things that I would recommend that you do not do, because these things can really hamper your ability to become a researcher. One, don't expect to change the world on your first piece of research. It's unlikely. It may happen, but it's very unlikely. I see this sometimes in new students where they don't want to engage in a particular piece of research because they've looked at it and they determined that it's just not impactful enough. I'm going to wait until I find a piece of research that's more impactful. And, that's not a really good approach to progress towards your PhD. Why not take a problem that's a real problem and an important problem and push forward on that problem? Why wait for the right problem when the right problem may not come along? You may do work that changes the world, but it's certainly not a requirement, to get a PhD that you do groundbreaking, earth-shattering, awesome research. It's not a requirement. You have to do original work. You don't have to change the whole world. The example I always like to give to my PhD students is like, thinking that you're going to change the world on your PhD, having that expectation, it's like going and learning how to ski, and then telling your ski instructor on the first day that I'm intending to join the Olympics after this class is over. I mean, you are getting a start to your career, and you'll have the whole career to try and change the world. And that's a great goal in your career, is to try and change the world, but don't have too high expectations in terms of the impact of your research initially. Hope for the best, but don't reject work and progress because you don't think that it's impactful enough. Second thing I think you should avoid is uh, you should not avoid failure and rejection. Why? Because the path to a PhD is fraught with failure and rejection, right? If we're publishing in top conferences, that means we're getting rejected with high probability. There are way more good papers that go to these top conferences than they can accept. And so you're going to have to deal with rejection of your papers, rejection of your proposals, rejection of your ideas. And that doesn't mean they're bad. It just means it's not time yet for them to see the light of day. So you have to steel yourself against that. It's very, very hard. It's hard for me. I've reached success in my career, but it's hard for me to see my new students have to deal with that rejection. So I always like to tell them, like, I know this paper is good. Now they may not have realized it at the review panel, but I know it's good. And if we keep working on it and improving it, we're definitely going to get it published. Another thing to avoid is reinventing yourself by working on research that doesn't leverage your core strengths. I see this in students a lot often. Like, well, they say like, oh, I'm my background's in power electronics, but what I really want to work on is recurrent neural networks. And so what they do is just abandon all the work they've done up until that point and then dive into recurrent neural networks. That may be successful, but it's such an inefficient way to improve yourself by just throwing away expertise. What you really need to do, and it's okay to be interested in recurrent neural networks, you need to take your toys and move them into someone else's sandbox. You need to say, oh, what I should be working on here is low power recurrent neural network design. I need to bring my expertise along with me to this new problem. So it's not about not looking for new and interesting problems. It's about not abandoning your core strengths. And so that's really, really important, and it helps you grow. And I will say, some of the most interesting research is research that is at the juncture of these very disparate areas, primarily because no one's really looked at that stuff. And so you find really interesting things to do very easily. Also because, it's just interesting to see how very disparate areas can interact to produce some pretty interesting results. This next one's a little controversial, but I kind of live by this rule, and it's worked really well for me. And I would encourage other people to do this as well. Don't try to be perfect, because we can't be perfect. And so when you try to be perfect, you just spend too much time and resources trying to be something that you cannot be. There's an old saying that the impediment to progress is perfection. And I really believe that to be true. Let me give you an example from my interactions with former students where I see this. Have you ever been in a situation where you're writing a research paper and you have to share that research paper with your collaborators, but it's just not good enough? If I rewrite it again, I know it's going to be good enough that I can share it with my collaborators. And you end up spending so much time revising that work that you never actually share it with your collaborators in time, and you don't have enough time to iterate and polish, and you end up producing a substandard product for that paper submission. What you have to do is you have to trust that it's good enough, and you need to share it. You need to share it early. And so try to avoid that needing to be perfect. That's my advice. And then finally, try not to be afraid. I always tell new PhD students that the thing we do when you go into the PhD program is we bathe you from head to toe in uncertainty. I mean, it's, what research problem? How do I approach it? What are the tools I use? What are the expected outcomes? What's my hypothesis? Have I proved my hypothesis? Have I not proved my? It's, we are just bathing you with uncertainty. And that can cause a lot of fear and paralysis. And so what you have to do is you got to try and steel yourself to say, I'm going to push forward no matter what, because I believe that I can do this. I believe that I can do this. Let me give you an example. Students I've worked with where paralysis really gets in the way of their ability to produce research. I've worked with students in the past that, they produce many, 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 many results, but they don't look at the results. They come to me with our weekly meeting, and there's just piles and piles of numbers, and there's no interpretation of those numbers. And then you dig into it, and you start to realize that they're not looking at them because they don't want to see the possibility that the results are not going to be successful, right? Let's just produce the numbers, and then we'll figure out a way to spin it to publish it. Well, the better approach is to fail fast, is to produce the minimum set of results you need to know whether or not this is going to be useful or not. So looking at your results immediately as you produce them and trying to confirm or reject your hypothesis, that's the approach you want to take. But it's scary because you may fail, but don't avoid that failure. That failure is actually part of your research process. You're going to see that it doesn't work. You're going to figure out why it doesn't work, and you're going to address that thing that doesn't work. That's part of research. Another thing that can happen when you're early in the research process is you can develop what's called imposter syndrome. Imposter syndrome is this idea like, I really shouldn't be here because everybody around me is so much better than me. And it's similar to this fear that people have and the paralysis that people have. And it's amazing. I've worked with so many students in my career, and lots of them get this fear at stage 0. And then 3 and 4 years later, they're walking around the halls like demigods. Students wonder, how do they get all those papers? How do they do all that research? It's just a journey. And at the beginning of that journey, you're not really comfortable thinking that you know what you're doing. So what can you do? Fake it till you make it, and talk to the senior students. You'll find the senior students had the same feelings. How did they overcome them? And believe in yourself. Because you're in this environment, you were picked out of a pile of many, many applications. And, the reason why you were picked is because you got some great talent and some great potential. And, in my area, computer science, students tend to be successful at the PhD unless they themselves decide to leave for a job or some other reason. So there's great probability of your success if you stick with it. Here's some things you should expect of your advisors and research mentors, right? We have responsibilities too. You have responsibility to produce work and to try and work towards research. But as a mentor, I also have responsibilities as well, right? I'm going to help you find a topic. This is the direction we're going. Now, some mentors are going to say, I want you to work on this specific project and do this. I'm more of a mentor where I just kind of point in a direction and say, let's go this direction. Let's find something really cool in that direction. I'm going to provide you constructive criticism on whatever you're developing. Now, what is constructive criticism? That is like, I'm going to point out the good parts and I'm going to point out the parts that can be better, but I'm not going to point out the things that could be better as a failing. I'm going to show you how I would make those things better. And I'll just say that, like, if your interactions with your research mentors feel negative to you, then you have to ask the question, do they feel negative because the feedback you're getting from your research mentors is very negative? If that's the case, then that's probably not a very good research mentor. If it feels negative because you're getting feedback that's constructive and you're beating yourself up, that's not good either. And in that case, you should not beat yourself up, because that feedback is going to tell you how to move yourself to success. But just know that over time, you'll generate more confidence and you'll feel like you can do things more on your own. It's really, it's really the case. Students after 3 or 4 years are all of a sudden just off on their own, and there's little I could do anymore. I'm just putting money into the system and writing letters, and they're just off doing amazing stuff. So it happens, and it's really cool to see that happen. Your research mentors and advisors, typically they've developed a nose for good research, and they can help you determine if a particular direction, even before your first result, is a positive one or not. They can help you form those hypotheses. And so take advantage of that. I think that's really a keen ability that they have developed that you can utilize, and you will develop eventually as well as you get into more and more research. They're going to support you in those milestones to develop yourself as a researcher along the way of the PhD. Here at University of Michigan, for example, we have early on in the first 2.5 years, students have to do what's called a preliminary examination, where they do 3 to 6 months of research, and then they have to defend that research to a panel of 3 professors, not including your research advisor. And so it's my responsibility to my students and your mentor to you to help prepare you in the very best way for those activities. I tell my students, like, if you get a question in this meeting and you haven't heard that question before, then I've failed, right? I want to make sure that all the hard questions come out before you get into that environment. We're going to, as a research mentor, it's my job to find support for you. Fortunately, at a place like University of Michigan, you get guaranteed support. So even if I'm unable to find support for you, the department supports you through, fellowships or teaching assistants. I'll try to find my students research assistants as much as I can. And that's our responsibility. And they'll help you get a job after graduation, which is really important because, our networks are deep and very effective. So, you want to avail yourself to your advisor's network. So definitely do that. Here's a few tips on getting GSRAs and fellowships. And I'll just say, like, right now, things are pretty plush. There's a lot of research money. That could change in the near future, with all this inflation. But right now, things are pretty plush. So, there's a lot of research money available to students right now. But in leaner times, it helps to have some skills to get those research assistantships to help you move the needle to the end where you get your PhD. And so really the best way to do that is to be visible and do work that faculty are impressed by. I'll also say that, a piece of advice that I always give students is, some students are, on, big projects with lots of research assistantship money. And then, when it comes time to apply for a fellowship, you got to write a statement of research, et cetera, et cetera. And sometimes students say, oh, that's a lot of work. I know I have an RA. I don't want to engage in that. But I will say one thing to consider is that the amount of research money is fixed over a short period of time. So if you take the time and the energy, maybe you're a superstar, to apply for those fellowships, when you get that fellowship, you are essentially providing a research assistantship to another student. We will take that money that we don't have to spend on you and give it to another deserving student. So think of it, when you think of it that way, it's actually a pretty, I think, a much nicer endeavor to have to write all those statements and such to get those fellowships. Plus, when you transition into academia, it's very important to have those. And even in industry, it can help you find better jobs when you have those, really prestigious fellowships on your CV. And then a few anxieties that advisors can get about graduate students, underperforming. If you're over paralyzed or really having difficulty producing research, if you're going to an advisor and instead of talking about research, you're talking about tools problems and make file issues, I mean, this can really frustrate advisors because, they'll quickly start to wonder if this person has the ability to do research, right? Advisors, when they meet and talk, they don't want to really talk about tools issues. You deal with that at the beginning of a project. But they really want to be talking about, like, what did you measure? What did you see? Oh, what's our new hypothesis? How do we pivot or not pivot? What should be the narrative on this paper, et cetera. That's the kind of stuff we want to talk about. Other frustrations is, really deserving graduate students that we don't have the resources to support. Fortunately, that's not too much of an issue these days. And then, GSREs that need a lot of management. You want to, as quickly as possible, try to become independent of your advisor. You really want to just sort of be feeding them information. This is the direction I'm going, and then taking whatever advice they give you back. But it's not like working in a job where I'm going to give you a set of milestones. With a PhD, that's the thinker degree, right? You're solving problems. You're figuring out how to solve problems. by the end of your PhD, I really want you completely independent, and I'm just basically watching. I tell a lot of people that as a professor at a top university, I don't do research. I watch very talented students do research, and that's really how it is in that fourth and fifth year. I'm watching very talented students do really awesome research. And then I'll just add, as a PhD student, don't consider something that isn't going to be in your thesis as a waste of time. No, because we are developing you into researchers. And there's way more about being a researcher than just coming up with an idea, doing an experiment, measuring it, publish, present, rinse, and repeat. There's way more than that. You got to develop infrastructure, right? And you share that infrastructure. I mean, such a big part of my career and my recognition in the community is from infrastructure I built and shared. You need to manage, compute resources, right? If you're not in the cloud, you probably got a simulation pool of something, some form, or some kind of compute pool locally that needs to be managed. You need to help review papers, right? Because there's a lot of papers getting submitted to a lot of conferences, and we need help with that process. And you need to help with proposal writing and fellowship writing as well. So that's a very important. So don't think, if it's not in my PhD thesis, I don't want to do it. In a way, it's kind of a selfish approach to the environment, and don't do that, because people, if you're only concerned about yourself, it's just not going to be a great career path. All right, so there's a few ideas about how to get in and do research. I hope that that's helpful. If you'd like to discuss more, feel free to reach out to me. Now I'd like to just talk a little bit about writing a paper. And this is more meta material. I'm not going to say, introduction, and then these are my threat model, and then I got my experiment. So no, I want to talk meta strategy on writing papers, and some tips on how to improve the chances that your papers will get published. So assumption, it's good work. Assumption, it's described pretty well. Now, that's half the battle. All right, so a couple tips on getting papers published, which is very important, right? If you're at a top university, you're going to have to get some papers published. You're going to have to get some first author papers published. And if you want to go on to an academic track, you're going to need a bunch of them. So it's real important to know how to have success here. Tip number one, assume no one will read your paper. This is an awesome tip in my career. During the review process, people will not read your paper. Okay, so that's tongue half and cheek on that one. To understand why I have this tip, let's take a look at the modern review process. What is a review process, right? So when I write a paper, typically it's double blind, there's no names on it. We submit it to the conference. The conference then distributes it to their reviewers. The reviewers read the paper, and they score the paper on a number of different dimensions. How novel it is, should it be accepted, blah, 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 blah. And then, typically I'll rebuttal the paper. I'll get to read the reviews and rebuttal. I just got some this morning. I have to read them and work with my students to rebut. And then we will send that back, and then they'll decide as a group, what's called the program committee, whether or not the paper gets into the conference. So let's look at that review process with more detail. 30 to 50 professors, overworked professors that are already very busy, and they're asked to review 20 to 30 papers each over a period of maybe a month and a half to 2 months. And if you're in a super hot area like machine learning, and you're involved in a conference like NIPS, you could have, they may get 5,000 or more papers this year. It's incredibly large number of papers that need to be reviewed. Typically, there's more good papers that arrive at the conference than the conference can publish. How many papers can a conference publish? How many rooms are available at the venue where the conference is going to be? There's sort of weird things that just limit that ultimately. What you need to get published is you need a champion on the program committee, someone who read your paper and think, this is a really awesome idea. I want this paper to get in, because if you have a champion on the program committee, the chances the paper gets rejected goes way down, way fast, because there's somebody there who is an expert, who is deciding if papers should get in, And, unless there's another reviewer that thinks it's absolutely wrong and should not get in, which is pretty rare if there's a champion and an anti-champion, it's pretty likely if you find a champion, you're going to get in. So the key differentiator really is how efficiently are you able to transmit your key ideas to those potential champions? And that means, getting the word out on just a light skim of your paper. So let's look at how to transmit efficiently paper ideas. First of all, your paper should be a story. It should be a narrative. Well, here's the problem. Here's what we learned. Here's how we solved it. It's a story from front to back. I tell students, like, early on in the paper, I want to hear your elevator pitch for the paper. What's an elevator pitch? That's when you get into an elevator and there's a really top researcher next to you and you get 90 seconds to tell that other top researcher what your research is. And so you have to really boil it down to be able to transmit those ideas. So you're going to convey in the most efficient way possible. You need an on-point abstract. That abstract is super important. That is the one thing that'll definitely be read. You need a very clear and standalone intro. Don't try to bury the great results to the back end of the paper. It's not like writing a novel and we're going to have a climax, 15 pages before the end. No, put the great results right in the intro because it's unlikely that some reviewers are going to go past that intro. So put it in there with the insights on why those results are great. And then carry the rest of the paper in the figures and the captions. And so what you'll see is the skim reader will read the abstract, probably read the introduction, then look at the figures. I'm a big fan of the paragraph caption because it can tell the story of what the figures are showing. And the figures should carry the entire narrative of the paper. If you do that, you'll move the needle on finding those champions, and it'll be more likely that your paper gets published. So good luck. A few other tips I'd like to give. In my area, computer architecture and computer security, there's almost always a rebuttal period. That's where you get your reviews back and they've stripped off all the names and the grades and stuff, and you just see the comments. And then you get to rebut the comments. And, rebuttals can be helpful, but only in certain forms. So it's really your job as a rebutter to build your rebuttal in a way that is most accessible. And it has to be accessible by people that didn't review your paper. Where rebuttals come into play is there'll be, when the program committee meeting happens, there's a bunch of papers that got really good reviews. They get accepted very quickly. There's a bunch of papers that got mostly negative reviews. They get rejected very quickly. And then the whole meeting is spent on these sort of cusp papers. And so people start arguing about a topic, and then somebody will raise their hand and go, what did the rebuttal say about this topic? And then somebody will grab it and read the rebuttal. Now, if your rebuttal is like on the left here, if your rebuttal is like reviewer 2A, yes, with and gates, that's not a very useful tool to answer that question during the conversation of the review. But if you take your reviews and pull out 2 or 3 strong signals that you can rebut, and then synthesize a question, and then synthesize an answer for all of those particular comments, you will create a rebuttal that can be used in the moment by someone who did not read your paper. And that's very valuable. I've seen that many times. Tip the balance in direction of a paper getting accepted. So try to write your rebuttals not for the people that reviewed the paper, for everyone that might be worried about whether or not you addressed a key issue. And often you can make those questions in a way that can scoop up a bunch of different criticisms or questions about your paper. And then I would also say, name your research. Right? I often name my research. And I think that naming your research just shows how much you care about your research. The example I always like to give my students is, hey, maybe someday you'll have a kid, and one of the first things you'll do is you'll name the kid, right? Because it's very valuable and you want people to be able to refer to this new human very efficiently, so you give it a name. Same with your research. It's really hard to talk about someone else's research especially when it's complicated, when it doesn't have a name. So I tend to give all my research a name. And I like to use an evocative name. What does evocative mean? Evocative means that that the name evokes something about the research. Years ago, I had a project where we developed a CPU pipeline that would lower the voltage, would shave voltage very slowly until there were a small number of errors in the pipeline. And we called the project Razor. And we always said our motto was shave till it bleeds, because you want a few errors all the time. So a very nice evocative name, and it's really easy to find, any Razor papers, as they call them. And for bonus points, find a name that no one's ever used before, and then Google can tell you what everybody's saying about your research. That's also valuable. Here's a few other considerations involved in research as well. And I just, sort of just things that have, questions that have come to me over the years. And I think it's interesting to consider these points. One thing, as you get into your career, you may run into what are, typically called research conflicts. As a graduate student, sort of the most likely research conflict you'll run into is a conflict on who is the first author of a paper. Now, why would that be important? Well, in general, the communities view the first person, at least in computer architecture and computer security, where I work, the first person who is named on the paper is the primary contributor to the overall paper. And so students, that's almost always a student, students will want to, compete for that spot. And if you're on a project where there's many students on the project, it can, as you get closer and closer to the submission date, there can be conflict in that. And advisors need to be able to resolve that conflict. The way I resolve that conflict is I try to have each of my grad students working on their own project, and they contribute to each other's projects. But when we're writing a paper, it's on, student X's project. Student X is going to be the first author. So I rarely run into this problem, but it can happen. If you're working in VLSI or areas where there's just a lot of labor, it's really hard to be able to build something, a new chip, for example, without having lots of students working on it. And in those, when I've been involved in those projects, I would tend to draw from the master's pool as a way to sort of reduce the probability of those conflicts, because the master's students aren't expecting a first author paper. They're just following the lead of the PhD student. So this is one thing you may run into, and try to stick up for yourself, but ultimately it's the decision of the organizers of the research as to what's done here. And I hope that the decisions they make will be fair ones. Here's something I often think about. How hot is too hot? How cold is too cold? Research is hot or cold. Hot being that it's really popular and really exciting and people want to know more about it right away. And cold is it's not so interesting and and maybe it's fallen out of favor. Just to give you some examples, hot is machine learning research and anything related to machine learning today. And unsupervised machine learning can be even white hot. So there's very hot areas of research and cold areas of research. I'm not going to pick on any research, but there's topics that over time fall into disrepair, and you don't see much about them, and then after a while maybe they pop up again. Yeah. So what are the trade-offs here? In particular, when you're in a very, very hot area of research, it becomes increasingly difficult to publish papers. Really, really, really hard. And the creation of new and novel technologies becomes a race. And often you're racing against big industrial institutions that have lots of data that you can't, and infrastructure that you can't get access to. So it can be really, really difficult in some of these white hot areas. Me personally, I tend to move out of areas when they get hot. So I went, like 15 years ago, I went into hardware security because nobody was in hardware security. And I thought, oh, this is very interesting. It was as reliability was becoming too hot. I moved into hardware security. Then Spectre and Meltdown, thank you, people who worked on that. Now hardware security is white hot. And so I've been transitioning my students and my research over into the area of privacy research, which is a really interesting, contrasting area to security research. So hardware privacy research. And I recently gave a keynote. Go to my YouTube page, Todd Austin, at youtube.com. And you can see I recently gave a keynote on that transition. And for me, part of that transition is because it's new and interesting. And then the other part of that transition is I don't want to be in a white hot research area. I don't want to have to, stay up late at night wondering whether or not my research is going to get out in time before it's been expired by all the other entities that are trying to scoop me on my idea. So that's just this is my lifestyle request. If you're ultra competitive and you like that environment, then go for the white hot, but it's something to consider as you're looking for a research topic. And then what is your research style? This is an interesting question, one that you will develop in your career. I hope you take a time to consider what your research style is or what it should be. And over the years, I have developed a research style, and it's really clear to me, and it works really well. And I follow it everywhere I go. And I'll tell you what it is. So my research style is what I call a rule-breaking approach to research. And it's pretty simple. Basically, you identify a rule in a field that no one ever breaks, and then you work to break that rule. When you break that rule that no one ever breaks, on the other side of that is usually lots of interesting research. Let me give you a couple examples from my career. Early on in my career, I left my PhD. I went and worked at Intel, and I was really, I loved working for Intel. It's a beautiful company. I super respect for it. I always tell my students, if I'm Galileo, then Intel's Medici, because they are my patrons. And so one thing I learned at Intel was that, for every one designer, there were like 6 verifiers. It was crazy. There were so many people verifying the hardware. And so when I started a research project, and the rule I wanted to break was that we don't have to fix all the bugs. Now, actually, everybody breaks every rule all the time, but we were going to break it in a way where this bug, it doesn't happen very often. We're not going to fix it. And so we built a system called Diva, which could detect and correct its own design errors. And then that led into the Razor project, which was broke the rule that every circuit must complete every cycle with probability one failure in 10 to the 15 cycles. That's how people build circuits today. And so we said, okay, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to build it so that every circuit must complete every cycle with probability 1 to the -3, which is like ridiculous. You're getting errors all the time. And what was cool is we could run systems with half as much energy as they would normally run. Such an interesting result. In the Diva project, we were able to release processors into the field long before they were fully debugged. It was by breaking those rules, it's really exciting. Today, I'm working in the area of high security computing, and the rule I want to break, which is a very hard rule to break, I want to build a computing system that can't be hacked. That is it's pure heresy to even mention such a thing in the security community, but it's a rule I would love to break one day. And so, you can go to my YouTube page and see my journey towards that particular rule. It's a lot of fun to break rules in research because, first of all, they call it cutting edge research. The reason why they call it cutting edge is because as you push the envelope of research, you cut the edge, and it's actually upsetting to the status quo. Things change that are upsetting to people. I remember one time years ago, I gave a talk on Diva, this processor could tolerate its own bugs, at a big company that made processors. And at the end of the talk, somebody came up and says, "You can't do that. You cannot. No, that would not be. I could go to jail for releasing a processor that I knew had bugs in it." I said, "No, but they're bugs, but you're still correcting them all, So it's really interesting to see, people get upset by your research, and people get really excited about your research, and that's the place I like to be, and it's really informed my style. So definitely something to think about as you move into your career. What is your research style, and how will you approach new problems in a way that's informed by the previous work you've done? All right. Normally when I give this talk at this point, I'll just open up the AMA, but I'll just invite, my online friends, feel free to reach out to me. I'm Austin at umich.edu. You probably got, access to this talk from my LinkedIn page. You can always message me on LinkedIn. If you got any questions, I'd love to answer them. I love talking about meta topics like research and stuff. So feel free to reach out. And I hope this was useful. If you did find anything useful here, or if you've got other tips that you want to share with me, please don't hesitate to reach out. But best of luck to you on your research journey. Thanks.